CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Make America great again. We put America first now. We're doing trade deals. We're doing a lot of things that I said we were going to be doing. It's not easy. These other countries have become very, very spoiled with taking advantage of us. But take advantage of us no longer.
Just over a year ago, Donald Trump took over the US presidency. And while he did not have much to say about Africa before his inauguration, his comments since taking office have not done much to endear himself to the continent. Despite Trump's unsavory comments this month about African refugees, he has also threatened to cut much aid to the continent. And his America First approach will surely leave Africa in a tricky situation. So how has US policy on Africa changed under the 45th American president? And what is the state of relations between the continent and Trump 1 year on? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. In the time that Donald Trump has been the 45th president of the United States, there have been no signs of any major new economic or development initiatives in Africa, and the threat of major cuts to foreign aid still remains. Here's CGTN's Washington correspondent Daniel Renches with a review of Trump's first year dealing with African development.
When the newly inaugurated President Trump unveiled his America First approach, it wasn't long before his budget team proposed deep cuts to foreign aid that would hit Africa the hardest. Some members of Congress fought back.
The president's stated goal in his inaugural address of America First may instead mean America alone, and particularly in the context of Africa, may well mean America left behind.
Last year, lawmakers agreed to add a further $990 million to address famine conditions in several African nations. The threat of deep budget cuts in 2018 remains, though Republicans and Democrats who would need to agree such cuts are deeply divided as they prepare for midterm elections this November.
If the Democrats recapture the House or the Senate or both, then the whole kaleidoscope of American national politics changes. And the Democrats traditionally have been sympathetic towards overseas assistance. That's going to have an impact on the executive branch.
Donald Trump projected a more transactional form of economic engagement during a meeting of African leaders at the United Nations in New York.
We hope to extend our economic partnerships with countries who are committed to self-reliance and to fostering opportunities for job creation in both Africa and the United States. Africa has tremendous business potential. I have so many friends going to your countries trying to get rich.
Over the course of 2017, US goods exports to Africa fell 10%, and imports of African goods to the US increased by 15%, widening the US trade deficit with Africa by $10 billion. Major US corporations are more concerned about long-term interests, though.
When you look at the whole of government approach, we see many other governments from around the world in Africa competing in a way that we do not.
US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who's been without an officially appointed US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the Trump presidency, says he's preparing to travel to Africa in the early part of 2018. Tillerson also says that the force of arms alone will not be enough, making the case that creating economic opportunities can help to address the root causes of violent extremism in insecure regions of Africa. Daniel Renches, CGTN, Washington.
Over recent weeks, one of the US president's latest outbursts dominated global headlines when Trump used vulgar and disparaging remarks about immigrants from countries in Africa and Haiti. Now, these remarks did not go down well on the continent, but it's also not the first time Trump has taken a hardline stance on immigration. CGTN spoke to residents of Cape Town, Cairo and Lagos for their take on the comments.
America's development isn't really that more amazing than Africa, and yet African people deal with it on a daily basis quite well. So maybe Americans can actually learn something in regards to that and stop electing idiots as presidents.
What Donald Trump said is offensive because at the end of the day, we're all human beings created in the property of God. So we are all part of one.
America is not right because the country is for us, not for Donald Trump. We can go everywhere we want. That's a racism. That's not right what he's doing to us.
I think Trump is consistently proving that he's not a good leader. There's nothing diplomatic about him. There's nothing moral about him. And standing here on the African continent as an Egyptian, I won't be able to answer that comment because I guess we were raised to be more polite, to be more respectful.
I would like to tell Trump to revise your policies. You must understand that Africa, Arab countries and the Middle East are countries you cannot afford to lose. At the end, what you will get from this attitude is the hatred of peoples of the continents of Africa and Asia.
This proves that even as a president, he is the most narrow-minded person in the world. He's shown us that he looks down on African nations as being lower than the US. On the contrary, Africa has raised many brilliant minds, among them his predecessor Barack Obama.
Well, I think it is not unnatural of American President Donald Trump. We are used to what I will call infantile tantrums from the leader of the #1 nation in the world, because you expect such a person occupying that office to be responsible, to become a world citizen with his remarks and conduct. But time and time again, you have seen Mr. Donald Trump exhibit behaviors, make comments that is counter the posture of the American people.
You know, Trump is a man of contradictory character. You know, sometimes you see him as a businessman, sometimes you see him as somebody with uncut, language, somebody that was not brought up to respect the rights and personality of other people. And because he came across, so much wealth, he thought that the world is under his feet and he can do anything, say anything, and get away with it. What he has caused some countries in the some third world countries worse names than that. And he has a kind of pathetic hatred for the poor countries of the world.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, earlier we mentioned the derogatory remarks attributed to Donald Trump about African nations, but the US president has since issued a broad denial on Twitter about, quote, the language used. The African Union's ambassador to the US has been dealing with the diplomatic fallout. She says it's up to White House officials to deal with misperceptions of the continent.
After the African Union last week expressed infuriation, disappointment and outrage over the reported remarks made by President Trump, the AU's ambassador to the United States is concerned about America's standing in Africa.
If they were said, there is the potential for leaving scars that could be deep and difficult to hear.
President Trump issued a broad denial about what he termed the language used during the meeting concerning changes to immigration policy. Senator Dick Durbin, who was in the meeting, insisted the reports were accurate.
Part of my agenda includes improving relationships between Africa and the United States. So along that line of thinking, my work is cut out for me. I will be reaching out. We will continue to have the dialogue, and I can assure you I will be in their faces so they know who the African is and what we will and will not accept.
Ambassador Chiombari Kwao was on a panel hosted by the Brookings Institution's African Growth Initiative, which included a passionate plea from the co-founder of Acon Lighting Africa.
And I'm here to tell you that this generation will transform the continent. We know the challenges. We've traveled the world, we've seen it. We've traveled the world, we understood the world. We've traveled the world, we know how nations are built. We are doing what we can and what we can't, and to invite the diaspora to know that Africa will not change without them.
The controversy comes just 2 months after Secretary of State Rex Tillerson hosted a large group of African ministers and is in the process of planning a trip to the continent soon.
In a statement, a State Department spokesman said the US will continue to robustly, enthusiastically and forcefully engage with African partners, promoting what they call this vital relationship and listen and build on the trust and views of their African partners. Daniel Wrenches, CGTN, Washington.
And now to offer more insights into Africa's relationship with US President Donald Trump 1 year after his inauguration, I have expert guests standing by. In Lagos, African Affairs analyst Jalingo Abdel. In Washington, D.C., Ni Akwete, Executive Director of the African Immigrant Caucus. And with me in studio in Nairobi, Dr. Alex Awiti, Director of the East African Institute at the Aga Khan University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program. Dr. Awiti, I want to start off with you because I know you've been following this very closely, as has the entire continent here. Donald Trump's recent derogatory remarks, let's start there though, they're still causing a huge furor. The AU is going to be discussing this at the AU summit this January. The African leaders, African Union ambassadors are, asked for an apology there in New York at the UN. This has sort of come as a shock realization for the continent. Why?
Well, I think Donald Trump, we have to bear in mind, is a very uncharacteristic president. And therefore, his very undiplomatic way of engaging with Africa, and especially the expletive they use to describe the continent, is pretty unfortunate, but not totally unexpected and not totally out of Trump's character. Remember the first time that he talked about Africa when he was addressing the heads of state on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, he misnamed Namibia. He called it Nambia, and he did it twice in that speech without even realizing. And his total understanding of Africa is just a place where some of his friends are making a lot of money.
So is this a misconception, though, from Trump's perspective, do you think?
I think Trump is just honestly naive, and he's not pretending about it. I don't think that even his staff and his handlers are interested in trying to get Trump up to speed in terms of understanding the continent, because I think it is very consistent with the Trump America First mantra. And that whole concept, it's make America great again. Africa does not feature in any of Trump's agendas, only to the extent that it is consistent with some of the security and national security objectives that Trump wishes to pursue.
Right. Nia Kwete, do you share that view, though, that Africa does not or has not featured in the last 1 year in the U.S.'s agenda?
You know, I share it up to a point. Because as much as it pains me to say it, since in Washington my work is trying to get the United States to take Africa more seriously, for better relations between my adopted country now and the continent of my birth, which I'm still attached to. But it is not, it's become worse under Trump. But, to my mind, Africa has never been as important in U.S. foreign policy as I would like it to be. And I've spent my entire career trying to push for that. So yes, I don't like what Trump said. I actually take it personal because he talked about immigrants from countries and he used that vulgarity. He was directing the vulgarity at me personally. And I have spoken to some of his officials privately and publicly. So I think what he said is not defensible, and it is terrible under him, but it did not start with him. Africa is not as important to the United States as I would like to be. I would like it to be.
Right, Jalingo, let me just bring you back to the crux of the matter, though. If you mention America's problems versus the continent's problems, though, but we do have America dealing with its own problems. But you have a lot of thousands of African immigrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea each year as economic migrants trying to find a better life on the other side of the continent. Who's to blame for that, though?
You see, If you look at an epitaph that is written right under the foot of the Statue of Liberty, that poem that was written by Emma to raise funds to protect that statue, it said the statue did not, they say America is a home of the exiles. They didn't ask for the best to come from across the world. They say, give us your distress, give us those who are tired, give us those who are looking for a way out of the inanities of this life. That was what America stood for. So if people are crossing, migration, as a matter of fact, is a global phenomenon. People will continue to cross the Mediterranean back and forth, both in search of a better life, both in search of opportunities, and as well as going to build bridges across the globe.
Right.
So
Let me just get Ni Akwete's comment here, because he's a representative of the immigrant caucus here, though. Because if you look at where Africa is today and its relationship with the U.S., Ni, because you did mention that Africa's policy within the United States is not where you'd want it to be 1 year on in the Trump administration. Where would you want the U.S. policy on Africa to be today?
I would want it to be very important for not just Mr. Trump, but his cabinet and the Congress, the Senate and the House, and also the media and public to understand how important Africa is, even if you are looking at it from the very selfish point of view of how does America push its own interest. You know, Mr. Trump says that terrorism is very important to him, and he looks at the Middle East. But what is regarded as the Middle East includes a big chunk of North Africa, the Maghreb. And they have problems there in terms of fighting terrorists from even Tunisia. There was a recent incident. There is Libya, there is Egypt, there is the Sinai. And I just read that the war in Yemen is blowing back into Somalia, which is right next door to Kenya. So just even security, Americans need to take Africa seriously. But it's not just security. And if I also might, you know, what Mr. Trump said was terrible, but we should not think that it is just him. I mean, I think one of my colleagues said Mr. Trump is not well informed, and I agree with that about Africa. Right. But there are European leaders who are very well informed about Africa, and they still don't want Africans in their countries. And I think that is atrocious, given the hundreds of years they exploit Africa. They still come to Africa. How come Africans can't go to Europe?
Dr. Awiti, I want to wrap you in here, because during the tenures of Presidents Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, we saw their priorities as, you know, energy for Africa, health and good governance for Africa, trade, particularly AGOA for Africa. What kind of priorities are we looking at in the Trump administration for Africa?
Well, it's very interesting. If you go back to September last year, when President Trump addressed African leaders, a small section of them, it was a very strange conversation. And none of these things that you've talked about, health, democracy, fundamental civic and political rights, the very core of issues that define what America projects as its values, that did not feature in the conversation at all. So, but I think what I want to talk about, what I want to say is that relations between countries are bilateral, and they're between states, and they have to be established in that sense. And it's about interests of states. So I don't think we should fault Trump to the extent that he has not found anything that appeals to the United States' interests as defined by Trump in Africa, and therefore take Africa seriously. We have great relations with China right now, Indonesia, Turkey, and all these countries are beginning to look at Africa very differently and coming to build strong bilateral relations. Israel has been here several times, once an observer position in status in the African Union. So we need to ask ourselves, what is it that Africa would want from the United States, and how do individual African countries then diplomatically and methodically craft these relations that then speak to their mutual interests? We cannot sit here and just keep saying that Trump has no agenda for Africa. What is Africa's agenda with regard to relations with the United States?
Well, Ni Akwete has been following up on that point. What is Africa's agenda that would appeal to the United States?
I think that's a great point, but I will differ a little bit. You know, all the countries that Dr. Awiti mentioned, China, Turkey, and the others, they are not as vibrant democracies as the United States. And I think democracy is important in this sense. In the United States, he mentioned Mr. Trump's definition of American interest. That's true. But it is not left to the president alone. The Senate has its own definition, the Congress has a definition, and above all, civil society, of which I'm part, we would say it is our right to tell the government we pay taxes to what its interest should be. And then if you swing it to Africa, you know, the African Union, this is where I will take a slight difference from Dr. Awiti. He's right that it's between states, but states can come together. We have the European Union, and of course we have the African Union. The African Union wants to make the diaspora the sixth region of the continent. It wants to engage with us. We have a wonderful AU ambassador right here in Washington who's reaching out to the diaspora. So we as citizens and residents and taxpayers of the United States, what I do is we want to push the United States to say properly defined American interest needs to engage with Africa, but at the same time we want to help work with the African Union to say that yes, here is what Africa's agenda should be for America. So I think it should be multilateral. That's where I see it slightly differently from Dr. Awiti.
Jalango, I do want to come to you there in Lagos because counter-terrorism and security issues has been one of America's big focal points on the continent, though. And of course, Nigeria has been suffering from the Boko Haram insurgency. With the U.S. now, the U.S. mission in the UN cutting off, its assistance or some of its packages to the UN, do you see counterterrorism on the continent suffering? Issues such as trade and other issues, climate change, how much of that is going to be affected?
Well, I think that first of all, I would like to commend President Trump on his position on terrorism. He has been very definite about what he wants, and he took the battle straight to ISIL. And right now, the organization has been very, very seriously decimated, and they do not have any so-called caliphate anymore anywhere in the world. And but I would say Nigeria, we should also commend the government in Nigeria because since the assumption of this, the President Buhari's government, he was also very, very forthright with the Boko Haram insurgency. And I think the government of the United States has also been very, very supportive in that direction to make sure that that organization was dealt a very terrible blow in Nigeria as well. But the position of the President of the United States on the climate change accord in Paris definitely will affect other issues as they happen in Nigeria, because part of even the herdsmen crisis is the reason responsible is climate change, because most of the green forests are drying up, the green herds are drying up, and in search of how to feed their cattle, more and more crises will continue to come between the farmers and these herdsmen in Africa. And it would have been expected that America will continue to drive that policy of climate change to see how these problems can be ameliorated in the future. But obviously, America is missing out, and they are leaving a vacuum that I think that China and other countries can take advantage of, talking about African foreign policy moving forward.
Right. Dr. Awiti, and that brings us, though, to where all this leaves Africa in terms of the lack of American interest on the continent. Where does this leave Africa in terms of geopolitics, though, in terms of Africa's economies, in terms of trade and investment from the United States? Where does this leave the continent?
I think this goes back to kind of the old question. Africa is a vast continent of untapped potential. What we haven't done is look inwards and see what is it that we have with each other. I think part of the problem is that we are anchored in this raw primary commodity space to a point where we cannot even trade amongst ourselves. And I think this is part of the problem, that we have to look outside for people who come and take and add value to our products. I think part of what we now need to figure out is, both as Nee said, how do we craft clever, strategic, bilateral relationships combined with multilateral relationships and bring in the right partners at an African continental level, with AU championing that, to then help Africa begin to galvanize its vast and trapped resources to start dealing with our problems by ourselves. You asked the question to a colleague in Nigeria, whose problem is it that Africans are migrating across the desert and risking their lives and dying? It is my problem. It is my president's problem. It is the African Union Commission's problem. So how do we start to deal with our problems? Then people begin to look at us with more respect. I think there's a lot that has to be said. about the critical fundamental failure of governance and governance capability of the continent that basically makes people like Trump have the license to call us whatever they want to call us, because it's how we project ourselves. So let's get our house in order first.
Right. Ni Akwete, of course, with the changing geopolitics and with the lack of interest from the United States on the continent, how much of this is having an impact on Africa's politics, with the rest of the world, on Africa's economies, on Africa's trade as well? Is there a vacuum from the United States?
I think there is. I think there is, but I have to also stress that, you know, we should not think that Mr. Trump, as powerful as he is, and he's the legally elected and a de facto leader of the United States, but the Americans divide power more than any other country I know. They call it checks and balances. Mr. Trump has his opinion. There are many centers of power that disagree with him. So I will say to the audience and to my colleagues that, you know, even on climate, where Mr. Trump turned his back on the Paris Accord, I can tell you California, which is the largest state here, is embracing it. Different states are embracing it. Congress is somewhere in the middle. So that, in fact, one of the things happening in the U.S. is that there is a backlash, a reaction to many of Mr. Trump's policies, that people say, no, this is not good for us. And they do realize that he's leaving a vacuum for America's rivals on the international stage to move in, the Europeans and the Chinese now. And quickly, on the question of governance in Africa, I agree totally with Dr. Awiti, which is why I will say to Africans, my fellow Africans of all stripes, don't turn your back on the U.S. because the U.S. is a vibrant democracy. People talk about governance. I prefer the word democracy because that is clear what we mean. I think Africa needs democracy, given our diversity and given the conflicts that we have. If we don't have democracy, we will descend in war. So the example of American democracy, I think we should copy. America is not just Mr. Trump.
Right. We'll leave it there, gentlemen, for the moment. But thank you very much for joining us on the program. That's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights in Lagos, African Affairs Analyst Jalingo Agban. In Washington, D.C., Ni Akwete, Executive Director of the African Immigrant Caucus. And with me in studio, Dr. Alex Awiti, Director of the East African Institute at the Aga Khan University. Do remember you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.